this is a bit of a if wait, you're streaming now, right, Dord? I just sort of started without warning you. Okay, good. So this is a bit of a, I guess, a storytelling masterclass, though it's not really storytelling, it's a visual storytelling. And it's basically using visual cues to attempt to get people to see the context of the artwork or whatever you're making actually is in. Now, that may sound a little bit confusing. However, basically, for the most part, when creating your artwork, you don't need to necessarily explain every single detail to the person. Sometimes it can be a good idea to make sure that you don't try to force someone to see what you want, but you can tell a story and give points of reference so that they know the direction you're heading in, but not necessarily everything that you mean. And this is the first example, which was just a speed build I did in like 8 hours, I think. I don't necessarily remember. And for this, I'm using this as an example because I'm using two different techniques to attempt to actually give you context clues of what this actually is about. Since to me, this was a mystery build. That's sort of what I titled it as, even though I should have titled it differently. That was the title that I did end up using. And for these context clues, I'm using, for example, these writings here in this. And visual cues can include, color, shape. Excuse me, make sure I look at everything, make sure I mention all of them, like color, shape, hue, text, lighting, all sorts of different other things will have different cues and effects on when people are looking at it. And that, as mentioned, includes text. And whenever you have the text in the scene, it gives people context clues of what it is. Now, obviously, don't use that in every situation, but in this situation, it looks like alien text or really, really ancient text. And I didn't really want people to know, so I didn't specify too much information in this. And then with the desert around, it's very plain, and you just see this random build out in the middle of ran into it. This random structure out in the middle of nowhere without very many other details to tell you about what is happening. So in this case, there's almost a not enough details to actually describe what is going on in the scene. And it seems backwards for this being the first example for this class here, but it is pretty decent. For the most part, switching subjects a little bit, to create something that tells a story can be very difficult, and a bit of a shortcut that I use when trying to tell a story with something along these lines or other kinds of structures is I try to think of the structure as a character itself. Because whenever you design a character or an organic, you generally design, the clothing to fit the personality of the character. Why not the structure? A good example of this is these alien bits here. This is a part of this structure. And this gives you details about its past, just like how you would with a character, as mentioned previously. It gives context. This can be extremely, extremely useful whenever you are trying to detail stuff, to think about it in that way, as if it's a character, to try to create a structure's personality. And there's a lot of different techniques to do that, and I'll be going over hopefully all of them, though I've written down quite a few. And I think I may need to switch to the Bedrock version pretty soon, once I in about like 5 minutes, to hopefully explain everything else in that world there, since I have a world with better examples. But another thing with that, okay, with this is storytelling can be extremely difficult. And that's one reason why I chose this, is because it's extremely difficult to explain. So you're gonna have to sort of figure out on your own in a way, but sort of find different resources that will help you. For example, color theory. Color theory is a extremely useful tool that I attempted to use here with the orange and the blue, and that's with the visual language. And yeah, the title was incorrectly done. You're building like a historian, if you understand my meaning. So you're creating a history for the structure as if it was a real historical piece of architecture. However, the title was slightly misunderstood and was put as historical architecture. Though you can use these techniques exactly for that use of creating historical architecture, because you have to be very detail oriented and think about each detail as if you're a historian. If any of you've ever taken an AP World History class, you'll understand that quite well. Is you have to make assumptions about certain parts and logically go through each step to explain each part. And hopefully, I have a couple examples that will help you understand that. So, if you do like historical architecture and wanting to do something along those lines, this can definitely help you for sure. Though it's, as mentioned, extremely difficult to explain since it's almost all theory. Um, but hopefully you will get something out of this for that use. I'll actually use an example, and the example is a ferry structure. Now, what I have up here is completely useless. I'm just going to basically fly around since this is almost like a panel rather than something that's like showcasing anything. So, a great example of this for the history part is, let's say if you're building a ferry house. And if you're building a fairy house, obviously fairies have wings. And if fairies have wings, why would you build a walkway up into the structure? Why not just have a landing pad for them to fly up on? And that's something a lot of people do is end up creating landing pads for their structures for whenever a fairy lands on it. And that is a way to make sure that there's like this continuity. They're flying, they don't need a walkway. But if you do add a walkway, you're telling the viewer something important, because if this fairy or wizard, well, let's continue with the example of the fairy. If this fairy continues on and actually walks into their structure, that is extremely, extremely important information. It doesn't sound like it, but it's extremely important. Because if they're walking into their house, they have a reason, right? Like if you could fly into your house and it costs you nothing to fly, then obviously you would fly into your house. So because that walkway is there, the fairy is using something to actually fly, whether that be muscle, but or pixie dust, for example. And most likely it's not muscle, because if it was muscle, then it still doesn't make any sense because they fly around all day. If a fairy would fly around all day, going around to different plants and going through each one. And as tell, plants can go from all sorts of different places for miles and miles and miles around. So if you were a fairy and you can fly and you were using muscle and you were that strong to be able to fly for miles, what is a couple feet just to get into your house? That's sort of like the idea there. So pixie dust is the only alternative. And you can keep going down that rabbit hole and create more and more information. So if they have pixie dust, there must be a limited amount. Otherwise, they would just keep creating or making the pixie dust or wherever they get the pixie dust. If they had an unlimited amount, they would just still fly in their house. And if they just flew into their house, they still wouldn't need the staircase. So if you built a staircase into a fairy house, that must mean that they have a limited amount of fairy dust and it's difficult to get, or there's a steady stream of fairy dust that they collect over a period of time. And you can keep going down that rabbit hole as mentioned, and you could even create a story out of it. This is one reason why this is a more about story and telling stories through visual language, is because you can keep going down that rabbit hole and figure out every detail. And even though, as I mentioned, you shouldn't try forcing people to see every detail, if you know every detail, it can help the person that is trying to create a mental image of the entire world in their head of what's happening in your universe. You can use this for role playing games as well. I want to go one step further. That fairy example. I know I've been talking about that fairy example for a while, but with that fairy example, you could go further and say possibly there is, if these are spring fairies and they flew into their structure, then these spring fairies would have, let's say fall fairies as well. So there'd be spring fairies and fall fairies. And if I was going to make a story with the idea that the fairies do not have an unlimited amount of pixie dust, I would probably have it where the fall fairies are the fairies of death, and they destroy the summer, and they take everything away, and for fall and winter, and then the spring fairies have it during the spring. I would probably, if I was trying to create a story, a visual language, I'd probably have this is sort of difficult to explain since I don't have an example of this. So sorry about that. Very, very sorry. Um, I probably have, just pretend this is a tree. I'd probably have spring and the death fairy in the ground. And the death fairies would probably house the pixie dust. And most likely, because each in my universe would hibernate during different times of the year, I'd probably have it where the death fairies would house the pixie dust, and the spring fairies have to go capture the pixie dust from the fall and winter slash death fairies. And in that case, it would sort of lead into this conflict between those two people. And you can sort of show that between, them having others being in this nice tree up in the leaves. So this kind of visual language, you can keep going further and further, and that was just from the stairs. And you can keep just going and going and going with the story until you can create an entire universe just because you put stairs on a fairy house or you didn't put stairs on a fairy house. It's sort of like thinking like a historian. That's one thing I learned in my AP World History class is thinking like a historian and developing a like assumptions and creating a story with continuity and to sort of prove that this is how things go and you know exactly how things are going to be to the extent where you know their past and their future. And this is super over detailed. This is way 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 over detailed, and I would not recommend it for every build, for sure. But for a lot of builds, especially medieval or, well, I guess any build, especially historical, actually, it's a good idea to think through each of these details to make sure that you don't accidentally add something that will mess up the continuity and like the story that you're trying to develop in this. And I'll use this build right here as the last example, and then I'll have to switch over to a different world so I can actually explain it. There's an issue with transferring. Anyway, let's not get on that part. A little irritating. But for this was a mystery build, and I wanted to make sure that I left out a lot of details because I wanted people, when they saw it, to wonder what this was and why was it so large out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out here. There's a couple trees, some rocks, and a desert. Where did this come from? And that's what the visual language that I used was attempting to show, is that you don't know, but still giving a couple things. Yeah, we're about to switch to the MC Bedrock version of the stuff. Yeah, as you mentioned. Um, anyway, which I will be switching over like now. I'll let the Dord Sword do that while I look through my notes, make sure I got everything going while he's switching over. Just tell me whenever you're ready, Dord. I'll probably mention a couple other things about some stuff while I'm at it. Make sure I got everything. Okay, so for the most part, make sure. Okay, sorry. There we go. Okay, I am currently in the world and I'll teleport you over, Dord. So when it comes to telling a story, this world I think does a fairly decent job with this. And let me mention the different things I have in my notes, which I'll have a link to the notes so you guys can actually check this out, which should help out a lot. So there's a lot of different things that you can actually use, and I think I'm going to go through this. So you can use color, as I mentioned, shape, organics, and you can also use the composition and context of the build. And I think what I'm going to probably mention is first is the not context, the characters. Characters can be very, very useful when you're trying to tell a story in a build, primarily because they are emotion. Whenever you have a character, you can see the emotion in the character's body language and face, and that is obviously extremely, extremely useful. Now, this build does not really show an example of what I'm about to mention, but incomplete action is another way of doing this. So, if a character is right in the middle of something, like let's say in the middle of punching another character, obviously, your brain will actually fill in the rest of the information. Your brain will actually see the character being punched, even though you don't actually show the character being punched. And that is actually pretty important because then you can actually almost create an animation in people's minds rather than actually animating the character, which is very, very useful, as you can imagine, because you don't need anymore to actually explain or like every single frame. You don't need to make an animation to actually animate a character just by having an incomplete action. Now, obviously, this does not have an incomplete action. I wish I had a better example of that, but oh well. Another piece that is extremely useful, which I actually used in here as well, is story contrast. There's different kinds of contrast, which most people generally assume that there's only one, and that is the like contrast between black and white or the contrast between red and green, which I did use contrast between red and green in this. However, story contrast is whenever you have here, let me actually teleport Dord over to this, to the organic, if it lets me. Yeah, make sure you're looking at it. So with this build, the contrast between it is you see this pleasant town, and you would expect, if you only saw the town, is just a normal, pleasant town that you wouldn't expect any trouble from. However, the real punch, the hook of this, sort of like how you would write an essay, the hook of this is actually this organic. The organic is extremely brutal, as you can see, with the spear like structure sticking out of his stomach and his right arm removed. It's extremely brutal, and it's something you would not expect whatsoever from a pleasant, quaint little town such as the one that you see beside it, as well as the castle. The contrast between this brutality and this pleasant, quaint town that you see causes people to really be almost confused by it in most situations. Now, obviously, you can't really be 100% sure what people are going to see, but having something that's contrasting just by the concept can be very, very useful. Another example of this is I saw an artwork of Japanese houses set up into like, Japanese temples actually set up into rows to look like they are like a suburban area. So this suburban kind of feel with the Japanese medieval houses that I saw in this concept art are completely different than one another, and you would never expect them to be put together, which causes them to seem, well, off, and it's unexpected. Sort of like the same way as if you were writing an essay, as mentioned, it's a hook. Whenever you see it, you are sort of confused by it, and you don't necessarily understand it, and it's intriguing to see those combinations put together, which can be extremely useful to use that kind of tool with what you're creating. Now, obviously, there's so many different ways of doing this, of doing that, and this, and many other things I'm mentioning. But that is another really good way of having contrast in your scene. As I said, there's more than the contrast between colors. There's, as mentioned, conceptual contrast, which is extremely useful. So the next bit would be we pause this and go and look at my notes. Okay, so another thing, I see a lot of people, when it comes to concept art, they try to look at color meaning, the meaning behind a color. You've probably seen all those charts that a lot of people make where you have, green means this, red means that, blue is calming, or green is calming, or red is anger or love, or black is death. Well, that is generally not true whatsoever. Maybe to some people, but only to some. The color meaning charts generally do not work because those are culturally based. Culturally based, like concepts such as the meaning of a color, almost never work. The only ones that ever work are ones that are universally accepted, such as red is warm and blue is cold. So those are the only two that you can really use consistently, and everyone is going to understand the meaning of those colors. But you can still actually make your own color meaning to can sort of fake it in a way. Not really like fake it, but an example of that would be, let me actually see if there's one in here. Well, no, I'll just mention there's a movie that I think I'm just going to mention the name. Sorry if this is going to mess anything up. But the name of the movie was Up from Pixar. That movie actually used this for music, but you can also use it for colors as well. Use the same kind of music throughout the entire movie, and at the beginning of the movie, they started out with a happy scene, and the happy scene is using a specific kind of music. And I know this is visual, but it's still going to be it's going to tie in. Just wait. The music was in a happy scene, and that happy scene slowly morphed into a really, really sad scenario. And they still had the exact same music playing. So instead of trying to figure out what music is sad or trying to play sad music or happy music, they played the same music. So you still had the emotion. Whenever you hear that music, you think it's happy because the first time you saw it was in a happy scene. So whenever you look at the second scene, you see that again, except for you hear that happy music, the music that you heard at the beginning during the happy scene, paired with a sad scene of Fred. I don't remember his name, but Fred's wife dying. It's a contrast. So there's contrast in that as well, which caused many people to actually start crying in that movie. And I think that's a great example of using contrast to your advantage. And you can do this exact same thing with color, especially in a Minecraft build. You can do that, but you can also do that with images where you use colors in there, and you create your own meaning for it based on the what is in the scene. Now, obviously, some colors do have meanings that are just natural to human biology, such as red being warm, as mentioned, or orange, and blue being cold, which are some very, very good examples of that. Now, I think that's a pretty good example. I don't know how else I'm going to be able to explain that. I don't want to over explain it, so I think I'm going to leave that at that. Another part of building, I see a lot of mistakes, and whenever you're trying to visually tell a story, is using organics just to use organics, which is actually perfectly fine because organics are really, really cool. But using an organic in a way that is too arbitrary, or it's almost like you're adding the organic because you had one and you want it to be more impressive. If you're doing something that's meant for storytelling, try to make sure you have everything planned out for the scene. Um, an example of this is the actual organic in this world. See, I told you this is going to start tying into this world. So, this organic in this world, it is male for a reason. This is actually going to go into stereotypes, and stereotypes are very dangerous because it's, as mentioned, like with the color thing, red, for example, can mean love or it can mean anger. And the stereotypes can also have that same problem. But in this case, I actually used a couple that are not really like common, but just the way that human anatomy works, it's just a very, very just normal thing to see. And this character that I have in this world is male. And I didn't want him to be male at first because men generally seem more aggressive because the way their body is shaped. It's like a V, there's more sharp angles. They're generally wider, generally larger than women, generally. So it's not always true, but for the most part, they seem more aggressive, more dominating. And I wanted to make sure that this character seemed extremely like happy in a way, not really happy, but could be happy. I wanted it to seem like it was friendly, someone that you could trust to help you when you're in need. Now, obviously, with all the problems he has and his black eyes, he does seem really creepy at the moment. But that was the original purpose of it. So I was going to make it actually a girl because they're a little bit smaller than men, so they wouldn't seem as large, so the character wouldn't seem as large and as dangerous as this character does here, which was, as mentioned, sort of the point is that he's supposed to seem friendly because he is not supposed to be a dangerous character. However, one thing with the storytelling that I wanted to make sure people saw was the rips and the his muscles being stressed. So that's one reason why I ended up actually making this character a male is because generally men have more defined muscles in their back and other areas. So I wanted to be able to have a character that I could manipulate the muscles to a greater extreme without making them seem like too buff on accident. So in this case, it worked fairly decent, and I even made him seem a bit more feminine than what he's supposed to in an attempt to try to make him seem more friendly, so you can understand that he is not dangerous. Now, obviously, it didn't come across perfectly, but that doesn't necessarily matter because I got my point across well enough that I'm happy with it. So that's the main part with that is like I'm happy with the way that he turned out. I ended up building each individual muscle so that I could define the stress and define exactly each muscle and how they're going to be tearing and how the cuts are going to be on the character. That's one reason why I mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, he is a male, is because I wanted to make sure that I could manipulate the muscles to in whatever extreme that I wanted to do. And I think that's, very, very, very useful. And with the example of the fairy houses that I used earlier, let me actually go back to that now that that's set in a little bit. That is an extreme. And I used it to such an extreme in that example that you don't need to do it that much, as mentioned earlier. But you can do little tiny things like that in this story. For example, let me teleport Dord over here. This is a little bit disturbing, but I wanted to make sure people understood the meaning and were slightly disturbed when viewing this. There is actually, make sure I undo my effect. There is actually um, this guy's arm is actually set over here. So this is a piece of his arm, and yes, this is slightly brutal, and I'm sorry for the amount of gore, but that is sort of an example of where you can take details from different parts of the world and intertwine them together so that they make more sense. And there's like a continuity to everything. And in fact, around the map, there's a couple carts that are filled with red glazed terracotta to represent them stealing and taking things from the character. The character is they're taking his energy away and they're taking things from him. And that's how I'm trying to link in those two things together. And obviously, most people actually do this on their own. Most people do those kinds of thing whenever they are building a world. They have the carts, they have those the wood around the places. They have a place where you can collect and cut wood, and all those different kinds of details. But generally, they don't take it to an extreme. And I would not recommend taking it to an extreme. But I think it's good practice to attempt to take it to an extreme. Which this world did not take it to an extreme because obviously like, I did not have that much time to actually make this world. However, if you do take it to an extreme, it's really fun. It's great practice for sure because you can create thousands of little tiny stories, like a story for every single house, even. And there's people that do that. For example, there's a guy I know, Jabombo, extremely good builder. He actually does that where there's a story and a name for a character in every single house. And I would not recommend doing that personally. That's going to take too much time. But I do recommend trying it out on a couple houses and seeing how it goes to develop a storytelling muscle because practicing storytelling is a great way to make your artworks make more sense, to make sure that your artworks actually y- so that you can tell a story in your builds or your artworks or whatever you're doing. And I think that's pretty useful. Now, obviously, that right there is for more. I keep saying obviously, sorry. Anyway, um, that is generally more for the artistic parts of building in Minecraft, and that's one reason why it can be used for massive amount of different things. But the next part is actually useful for designing mini games and things along those lines. Whenever you think through every single detail, it can assist you whenever you're doing mini games and other things along other things along those lines. Yeah. So, for example, the castle, which I'll teleport toward to. There you go. Here you go. The castle is a horrible, horrible castle. If I was basing it off of it being realistic and telling a story perfectly, because this castle is extremely, extremely like detailed and good looking in a way that makes it unrealistic and not very useful. If you're going to attack this castle, it'd be extremely easy to break in. I mean, there's a door right there. There's only like there's one door and you're in. Whenever it comes to castles, if you want to make a mini game, for example, and you think through every detail, like if you were a historian or using some of these things that I mentioned about thinking through every single detail and overthinking your build in the way and going too far, though don't go too overboard because sometimes if you go too overboard, it's just going to mess things up. Um, However, with a build that would be an actual RPG map or, for example, something that you would have in a mini game, it can be extremely useful to build something like an actual castle and think through if you were going to break into this castle, what would you do? How would you break in? And how can we prevent people from breaking in? And that can be extremely, as mentioned, very, very, very useful. Because if you actually look up channels, for example, there's a YouTube channel called Shadiversity. Really, really great if you're going to be building castles. Um, and I'll have a link to that, and I'll probably give Dort a link to that for people that want to watch a series on actually how castles were built back in the day in medieval period because that's actually really good for gameplay design. I mean, really, really good. I feel like I'm shouting out way too many people, but whatever. It's extremely good for understanding how you would actually design a castle if you wanted to make sure people could not break in. Because he goes through how whenever there is a castle from back in the day, they had redundancies. So if you're going to build a house, you only want one door to go into the building, or maybe two, front door and a back door, so you could like enter in the structure. Well, in the case of a castle that you want to be extremely difficult to break into, or a mini game, you would probably want multiple doors so you could have different doors that you could enter into so that you could trap the people that were trying to break in. And that can be extremely useful. Yeah, yeah, that can be very, very good because you can just keep wearing them down until they run out of men, which can be, as mentioned. So this build obviously is not like that. This build is obviously meant to be extremely good looking. And in the case of a castle for a mini game, you would not want it to look like this. You would probably want multiple walls and multiple doors that people would have to enter into in order to actually capture the castle. And that's one thing I see that is a little odd about a lot of mini games is that they make the structures extremely easy to break into. You just have to climb over it or have to walk through the door and pretend like you're their team almost. It's a little bit too easy to go in because oh, one second, I need a cough. There we go. It's too easy to break in because they don't have enough doors. They haven't really studied out how a mini game would actually work whenever people are playing through it and having it where there's only one door. Now, obviously, that's just one part where it's just the door, but there's many, many different parts of it where detailing it can actually make it more difficult to play on, which can be a problem. And as I said, if you think through each part, think about what you're making the build for. Obviously, this world was made to look good. Otherwise, I would have designed the castle to actually be defensible. And so on and so forth. So if you're actually going to make a world, think about exactly what you're doing so that you can spend the least amount of time that you need on it, or the most amount of time that you need on it. If it's a practice world and you're practicing something very, very specific, build on that world for as long as you possibly can nearly. For example, the organic that I did, as mentioned, I built every single individual muscle because it's practice for me. I wanted to make sure that I got plenty of practice in for the actual build because I wanted to learn the muscles. So I used it as a time to actually be educated about organics while I was building it. However, if I was going to do one for a YouTube video, obviously I'm not going to do every single individual muscle, and now that is obvious, and you know that. However, in many cases, you forget to think about it in smaller builds or builds that you don't necessarily think about too much, just a random build that you're just building. And if you actually think about what the exact purpose you want it to be for, it can really help you figure out how long you want to build on it. For example, if you want a build to only look good for a render, then you should probably not do the interiors. It's just going to take more time. So, on purpose, possibly don't build any interiors. Or if you have a castle and you want there to be like some interior, then only build the interiors that are necessary so that you can get it done as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible. These different things can be extremely useful whenever you are playing something through, yeah, as mentioned, thinking through every single detail, making sure that, this is what we're going to be doing so that you don't overdo something or underdo something. Many times, people will build something and they'll underdo something and they'll end up not making it detailed enough because they only built it for renders or for it to look good in a render. They will accidentally miss a lot of details that should have been added. However, as yeah, with a build that people won't be walking around in, you should probably detail it quite a bit more. But if the build is only going to be for a render and no one's ever going to see the details that you added, why add them kind of deal. So you have to understand, where you want this to be seen. Are people going to download the world and walk around the world? There's quite a few worlds that I really, really like the renders of. However, if you actually check it out in the world, they actually have a download to it. And if you actually download the world, it's not detailed at all. There's entire backs of buildings missing, and which is perfectly fine if you're doing that on purpose. But in many cases, people don't do it on purpose, and they don't realize people are going to be walking around, checking out every single detail, and as yeah, you're just gonna people are going to end up looking down on the build and not consider it to be as good as it is just because you forgot to add in those details. But as mentioned, if you did it for a render, perfectly fine. Don't mind it. If someone says, "Oh, you didn't do the back of the building," whatever, it doesn't matter. You didn't do it for people to be walking around your build. But if you know for a fact people won't be walking around your build and you want people to walk around your build, you should probably make sure that you got, some details back there or at least a joke or something that sort of ties in so people know what's going on with that. So let me make sure, yeah, see what the next part of this is. Yeah, context. This is another extremely, extremely important part of building, and this is something I actually haven't done in this world yet. And this is another part that's basically almost like a panel. It's not necessarily something I can really show in a Minecraft world because it's as more like theory again. Is the titles and the text. Now, I already talked a little bit about text and how that sort of identifies some things. But for example, the title can be so ridiculously important to a project. Now, I'm going to be using the example like, okay, let's say if you have a painting, and the painting is of a woman holding a dead baby. And now that's brutal. And I know this is a horrible example, and I'm sorry. Um, but for that example, if you titled it A Mother's Sorrow, then obviously you're going to assume that the person holding the child that is injured or ill or possibly, dead, then you're probably going to think that it's a painting about, a mother losing their child. However, if we titled it, sorry again, this is the only example I could come up with. If we titled it Psycho's Dream or um, Psycho's birthday, then you'd probably assume that, or just Psycho, you'd probably assume that the child was possibly didn't just pass away, and it was, there might have been some foul play involved. Just based on those titles alone, you change the entire way people are perceiving your build just from the title of of the build or the artwork. And many people forget, I've seen this all over the place. Many people forget to title their build something that actually supports what they're building. They just title it, fun Minecraft build or something along those lines. Well, if you title it something like that and you don't add the context that you could be adding, it may not be understood by people. And if you're doing something for storytelling purposes, then it's probably a good idea to make sure that you title it so that people understand what is happening, that it is in the future and not an alternative, thing. Or even, let's say, if you're doing a medieval build that is in the future or like steampunk, if you add in the title 2159 or something like that, then obviously it's in the future, but then you have like these dirt huts, and then you have like this explosion in the background, you're probably going to assume it's probably World War IV or something along those lines. So titles can be extremely, extremely, excruciatingly important for whenever you're trying to tell a story because they can completely change the context of what people see in your world, whether or not they're going to see what you mean or they're going to see something completely off the walls. Or hopefully you understand the meaning behind of what I'm saying here. But that can be extremely useful and very, very difficult to actually do. Now, let's see what the next part of this is. Also, one thing, another thing, yeah, is the atmosphere of a build. One thing I use for the developing an atmosphere of a build that help tell a story is here. Let me actually sort of lead you up into this. So the part of your screen, there's a part of your screen that is nearly always like 50% empty. Well, maybe not 50%, but is almost always empty whenever you're walking around a build or in a render or wherever, and that's the sky. In most situations, in most situations, there's a part of a build. Let me actually teleport you, Dord, over here to a part where I actually did this. It's the arm up in the sky. In most situations, there's many situations whenever you're walking around a build and you're just checking it out, you'll have parts of the you don't have anything in the sky. So whenever you're walking around or looking at the render, there's nothing above you. So that means like 50% of your screen is completely empty and blue. That's all it is blue. So you're in that situation of where you don't have anything up in the sky. That means that there is a lot of information that is lacking. And that means that you won't be able to get your point across as easily and you'll have to fit all of your details in on the lower 50% of the person's screen. But having something like what I have here, having this arm above this pathway, whenever people are walking through, like under the arm, they'll see it whenever they're walking through, and it adds information and adds like what is going on in the scene around them. And possibly one thing I might be adding once I in this area is like drapery from one structure to another, which I do not currently have. But that kind of drapery can really help add in some more details with that area. Let me teleport you over to this area as well. So with drapery, if I was to add some drapery in this area, actually I want to use this as a time to actually show an example of how drapery can completely change a scene. I'll be looking this way. If I was to add drapery in the scene, I could do a variety of different things. Let me actually use this example here and completely change a scene from one thing to another. So if I have drapery like this going from one side of the road to another, and this is not going to be the best drapery, so don't worry about it looking too great. Here we go. Have horrible looking drapery, and I probably need a cobblestone wall. So in this case, this is completely out of context and it's basically just a rope. Now, if I actually wanted to tell a story with this rope that's flying across, first off, I probably need to make sure I follow the laws of gravity. That sort of, yeah, whatever. You know what? Who cares about gravity anymore? The new thing is fantasy. Anyway, so I could tell different stories through this deal here. Now, this is more for Americans, since other countries may not have this holiday. However, I could do a Christmas themed one, and obviously, everyone's done this. Everyone's done this. You could have, this drapery coming down, and now, as you can see, it's obviously a Christmas themed drapery going across the screen. There we go. So that's pretty obvious that now it's Christmas time. So because of the colors and the blocks that I added on this drapery, now you know what time of the year it is. You know, okay, it's winter time. And obviously there's no snow, so they must be in a tropical region. If they're in a tropical region, that means that they're probably somewhere along the equator. So they're probably in the Caribbean somewhere if they're celebrating Christmas, because I can't see them celebrating it necessarily in China, possibly in Europe. So they could be near Greece, but it seems quite taking down. Yeah, there's a castle over there, so it's probably somewhere near Greece in the tropical regions around there, near the water where the warm air blows in from other areas so that it still stays warm, like the warm air from Africa. So it's probably in that sea over there. So just from the red, green, and white that I have here, either it's Mexico or it's Christmas time because I forgot that Mexico's flag is green, red, and white. But in this case, this is meant to be Christmas time. So for this, just because of the colors I used, as mentioned, now we know that it's probably somewhere in Greece or it could be Mexico because yeah, Mexican flag. Or we could completely change the context and we could add some other kind of holiday. So we're in a farming area, so we could use possibly farming colors. Let's see. What are some good farming colors? I could possibly even use, yeah, honeycomb kind of thing with that pattern on it. Or let's see what's another. There we go, blue and brown. I think that's a fairly decent farming color. We can make up our own holiday. So I'm guessing this is basically like Thanksgiving. This is the kind of context I'm thinking of for this one, and have a brown in there somewhere or a tan. If I can get another block in here, there we go. So now we have a bit of like a farming thing. I'm gonna keep it that one. There we go. So now with this, now we completely change the context of how this is seen. At least in my opinion, I think it changes the context. Of course, you might be seeing something a little bit different. This is sort of like a generalization of how this works, obviously. But in this case, because of the colors that we changed it to, and this is obvious that this would happen, now it's a different holiday. Now it's like a Thanksgiving holiday, or possibly this is gold, so possibly some a king's birthday or something. So now we don't know what time of the year it is. Most likely not near Christmas because otherwise they would probably have Christmas decorations up instead. So probably not winter, could be fall. I planned it to be fall colors. So we could say, okay, it's in fall, it's in harvest season. It looks like all the plants are about to be harvested. So there's crates around. So I would probably guess that this is somewhere near or close to fall in a tropical region. And obviously, that is taking it a little bit too far, but I think that's a decent example of how you can use different details around the build to tell people a story about like what's happening in the build. And you can take this as far as you want in the build, and I think it's pretty decent practice to take it just a little bit too far than what you're planning, because then you can use for whenever you are planning and doing something a little bit too extreme. It gives you a lot of context to be able to design something in that way where you're telling a story that's like extremely over exaggerated to like yeah, as I said, an extreme point of view. Now I gotta look at this part again. So a different part about this is actually planning for rendering. So whenever you're planning something for rendering, it's pretty obvious, but many people actually, whenever I someone asks me to do a render, they do not do this because they just don't think about it. But in the windows of places. Here, teleport you to this area, Dord. There you go. There you go. So in this example, there are jack-o'-lanterns inside of the buildings that I want to have people inside of. Now, this is obvious, and most of you, probably add in something in the windows if you're planning on it being rendered. But whenever you're rendering, they can change the block into something that is light emitting. And I'm saying this because there's so many people that I end up doing renders for that don't have anything in their windows. So whenever you go to render their build, you can't just automatically add in the window and just easily change the material and make it light emitting, which I think is very, very useful. And it gives them a lot of control because in certain windows, in certain places, they can have some of the builds blacked out so that it looks like those builds are completely vacant and there's no one inside of the build, which is sort of useful. So you can use that to sort of tell a story about who's in each build, who's not in each build. Um, Also, having a block that shows where you want smoke, because for example, if you are going to have a build that you want to have a lot of smoke coming out of a building and you want the render to actually have real smoke in it, definitely do not build the smoke out of cobwebs, which I have the build of the smoke coming out of here. Don't build your smoke out of cobwebs because then it's going to look like obviously like Minecraft blocks that are just turned into volumetrics. So in that case, I'd probably recommend using a completely unique block so you can tell the person that's rendering it which structures are meant to have smoke coming out of them and which are not meant to have smoke coming out of them. And that's sort of a way to help the render artist understand the story that you're trying to tell, because obviously if you're paying someone to render something, you want to make sure that they get it right. So helping them in that way will definitely be able to get you some better renders for the price that you would pay anyway for that kind of render. So that can be extremely useful. And I would definitely recommend doing that. And also, it would make my life easier if any of you, well, all you people that paid me to do a render, please do this next time. It's really annoying. Anyway, enough about me getting irritated at people not doing that kind of thing whenever they get me to do a render for them. Um, yeah, it's very useful, so I'd recommend it. However, if you're, as mentioned, if you're going to do this for just a Minecraft build for the smoke, yeah, just do whatever you want. Just have the cobwebs, and let me make sure I got everything going on still. Make sure what my next part of this is. Yeah, like earlier I mentioned continuity. Continuity is something that is extremely important. I want to make sure that I sort of run that home and tell you guys exactly what that is. Let me actually find an example of that in this build here somewhere. If there is a spot with it in there. It doesn't seem I have a spot that really showcases continuity really, really well. Let me check over in this area. It doesn't seem that I do, which is unfortunate, but that's perfectly fine. Actually, I think the trees are an okay example. So, Dora, if you just look at the trees wherever you're, yeah, near them. With these trees, I have two different kinds of trees. Obviously, the evergreen trees, and then I also have um, the palm trees as well. And I forgot to appear offline. Anyway, so with these palm trees, this is a bad example, but it's the best example I can use in this world to give you guys a visual reference that you can use for this. So when it comes to trees and things along those lines, um, you sort of need to make sure you don't have every single tree in the world. So having palm trees and having oak trees and having spruce trees and having, 50 different trees in the world, yeah, it's going to give you a very wide variety of trees, but it's not going to look that realistic. There's not a whole lot of places in the world that are actually like that in real life. I do live in an area with that many kinds of trees around here. There's, dogwood, there's oak wood, there's spruce, there's evergreen, there's different kinds of evergreen, there's like palm. I'm pretty sure it might be palm trees. I don't know. There's oak trees. There's just a lot of different kinds of trees where I live because I've lived in a very a slightly tropical but slightly cool area. So a lot of different kinds of trees can live in this area. However, in most places that you're going to be building, especially if you're doing something that is historical, I would not recommend using every kind of tree. Now, most people do not do that because building trees generally takes a while. That's a good example of continuity, is because whenever you have having something like that you're doing from real life to Minecraft, don't go too far overboard with the creative freedom. Another example of continuity would be if you have a, let's see, a certain kind of thing going on, then like if all the people in the town are 3 blocks tall. Let me give this person some invisibility real quick. If all the people in your town are 3 blocks tall, don't build all of your houses with 2 block tall doors. That should be pretty obvious, but uh, that is obvious. However, in many situations, people will end up accidentally breaking continuity, which is extremely easy to do because there's small little details that you can accidentally break. And I'm sure I've broken a couple in this build here. And with continuity, there's things that you defined and the things that you didn't necessarily mean to define that could cause a problem with that. For example, the person that built this castle is probably extremely selfish, and it's more of a palace. And palaces are, let me teleport you over here. Palaces like this one are meant to look good and mainly look good only. They're not defensible. As I mentioned earlier, this would not be a defensible castle. This sort of tells the viewer that this person's a jerk and had the people that live in this village build it for him. And depending on how new it is, that means that this king is probably a jerk because he didn't necessarily care about building a defensible castle. He just wanted to look good compared to all the other places around town. And let's say if you're trying to make the village look like it's super nice and that there's like all sorts of different things that are taking care of the village, and the if you're trying to make it seem like the village is very nice and like a utopia, then obviously building a castle like this that is only for the pleasure of the king, it would probably not make sense for this to be utopia, if you understand my meaning with this. There's small little details like that that you don't necessarily realize that your brain's registering, but your brain does sort of think through many of these details just from looking at stuff. Now, obviously, it maybe not to that extreme, but generally your brain does go through many of these details and looks at them and tries to figure the build out even if you're not necessarily aware. And that's how you get your opinion of the build, is based on how you see the build and how your brain is trying to fit the build together. So that's why trying to figure out the story for your build can be extremely important, because if you don't understand the story that you're trying to tell, or if, let's say, if you're not trying to tell a story and you're just trying to make it look good, there can be a issue, and that is that you do things that don't make sense. And whenever you do those things that do not make sense, people won't necessarily understand it, and then they'll be confused, and it causes them to not like the build as much. Now, obviously, that's a bit extreme. Obviously, you're going to like the build, and they're going to be perfectly fine with it. And if you're really good at building, it's going to look good. But having a little bit of an extra boost and having that story in there and sort of keeping that continuity can help people understand the build. And when people understand the build, they generally like it better. A great example of that is an old build that I have. I do not have pictures of this build. Well, actually, I do. I didn't send it to Dord, so you will not be able to see it. It was a long time ago, back whenever I was not very good at building. The build was not that great. However, it was extremely popular among the people that saw it, mainly because they could understand what the image was. They understood that it was a castle. They knew exactly what was happening. But in the other build, the next build that I did, most people actually did not like, even though it was quite a bit better than the previous. It was just harder to understand and harder to read, because the first one was very simple and easy to read, while the second wasn't nearly as simple and was a bit, well, obviously over detailed, because this was about 2 years ago, back when that was popular. So in that case, the build that was more popular and was probably considered to be better by many people was the one that was actually worse, mainly just because it was easier to read and people could understand what was happening. So that's a great example, a bit of an extreme example of how having something be something not make a lot of sense can make it seem not as good. But for the most part, that's about readability. It may not necessarily, like, story wise. The story doesn't necessarily have to make sense, but the readability makes sense. And readability is basically just making sure that you don't make your build a visual noise. And this is where color comes in as well. If you have too many details in your build, whenever people go to actually look at the build, it will look like there's visual noise, and it'll just be so detailed that it will actually look flat, and that will ruin the story and everything that's going on with it. In this build, I have it fairly detailed, and I have a lot of details in the front, like over in this area. And there's quite a few details here, but there's also a lot of areas where your eyes get to rest and take a break from the details. And it lets you see the build for exactly what it is and not get too distracted by the details that I have. And allows for the build to have quite a bit more depth than it would generally have whenever you look at it. There's that depth generally shows through better than whenever there's details in the build. One thing I see a lot of people do, of course, these are beginners, and most of you are pretty good at building. At least I'm assuming most of you are pretty good at building. If I'm wrong, then you just got a compliment. You're welcome. Um, if you use something like this, I see this a lot. They have these patterns on the front of a structure. You get slabs. And this is more like a building tip, but this goes in with the story. If you have these slabs and stuff, and you're trying to make a pattern, you've always heard the tip of make sure you have at least 3 blocks of depth. Well, in this case, you can just fall right down it and there's no depth, because you just covered up all the depth with a pattern. So adding patterns in your build can be useful. However, if you're going to do it, at least make sure that you have some room to make up for the depth that you're taking away from the build. Because in that case, it's flattening it out, and whenever you flatten it out, it makes it a little bit more difficult to see what's going on in the build, what's other things along those lines. So that's one thing I would recommend doing is that. And next part of visual noise is actually the color of a build and things that go along with color. So whenever you're doing color and you want to make sure that you show a story with your color, sometimes you will accidentally mess up your build by adding too much color. For example, if you use every color of the rainbow, it's just going to look like a rainbow, and it's going to be very difficult to actually see what's going on. Now, there's some people that can get away with that. There's a guy that I know, Endless Candy, really, really good builder. He uses pretty much every color in Minecraft and probably every block in Minecraft, and it still looks great. However, for most people, that does not work. And in his case, he uses it in very specific situations where he gradiates between them and he uses it as a detail rather than the using it everywhere. And this is where the color becomes very, very important. And I actually have an example of this, which I'll show. Let me actually see what this message is. Okay, make sure everything's going well. Okay, you didn't miss me. So with this part right here, there's this red nether wart, which I'm using as mushroom right here. This red nether wart, you probably don't think it's necessarily telling a story, but I mean, obviously, it's showing that's run down, and this is not necessarily, as I said, telling a story. However, you can use this technique to tell a story because those are around the build. However, there's almost nothing else in the world that's red besides very key points. For example, the bone and the arm that is over there, as well as the other parts of the nether wart and the pieces of the organic that are being transported around the build. So things like that are being transported, and there's very little bits of red, and it adds that little bit of color variation into the build that doesn't take it too far. Because whenever you're trying to add in colors to the build, don't do 50-50 or 33-33-33, or make it very even, because when it is even, it makes it seem like it is very like noisy in a way. Makes it seem it's easier for it to become visual noise because let me turn him to invisibility. It makes it easier to become visual noise because there's just too much of each in your eye. However, let's say you could use every color in the rainbow. However, if you make one to be the primary color and use it the most, then that can be very useful. In fact, you can use basically the exact same technique that is used for primary, secondary, and the third one can be used for this exact same thing. When that's basically about shape and shape theory. I'm not going to deal in detailing. So whenever you're adding, and I'll explain it slightly, you can use the same thing with shape. Don't add everything, as I said, evenly with an even amount of every single color. Add in sprinkles of some colors and have some be the primary color. So let me try to figure out which one of this. Okay, yeah, gray in this world is probably the primary color. However, there's gray, the primary color. There's blue because there's a blue sky, blue water, and there's a gray castle. So gray is sort of I guess the medium. Yeah, the gray is the medium. So blue is the primary color. Sorry, gray is the medium sized color. So there's most of the world is gray or tan, and those are like the base main colors. There's blue the main, gray the medium, tan the secondary, and green is another medium, and then red is the small complicated word I can't pronounce, but the smallest details in the map, small not the smallest, but small details in the map that I want to have like nice little bits of color are red, which also contrast with the green, which I'll mention color theory, and I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll make sure Dord tell me whenever I have like 10 minutes left or something like that, so I know I have time to answer questions and everything else and give some more better examples. since this is an extremely difficult thing class to actually teach, since it's you know like theory, no one likes explaining theory, including myself. Yeah, and I think what I'm going to explain now is probably color theory because this is something people get mixed up and like messed up very commonly is color theory. Because I need to appear offline. Oh, hang on one second. You appear offline, so this doesn't happen anymore. But color theory is something that can be misunderstood very, very often in a in a in like artwork or in a build. Um, so, for example, most people, whenever you see color theory, believe that it is a rule. Color theory is not a rule, but it is sort of a baseline to give an example and some idea of how to use it. The basis of color theory is that certain colors go better together because the frequencies of the color, whenever they reach and go into your eye and to your brain, match better or have greater contrast. So, for example, red and green are heavily contrast to each other. So they actually have. Let me actually make sure Dord's over here. Where'd you go, Dord? Here we go. Let me find you. Here, I'll just teleport you over to me. Um, so here you go. So in this example here, red is extremely very, very different to this green right here, and it has a very high contrast to one another. And color theory is very useful because you can use it to draw people's eyes to certain things. For example, over there to the organic, if you just turn a little bit, Dord is over there. There is a very bright and blue part of the organic that is sort of like a portal or magic coming out of him. It's very bright compared to the organic, and also it's blue, which is a cold color, and the character is a warm tan color. And because of that contrast, it draws your eye to it. So even compared to the other things that are in the scene, like for example, like his arm and his head, which his head's turning away from you, but whatever, that's the main thing your eyes going to be drawn to is that blue, as well as probably these lamps as well, depending on where you're actually looking at it from. And that kind of color theory is extremely, extremely useful because, as mentioned, you can draw people's eyes to specific locations or tell a story about what it is, but based on sort of like the meaning that I mentioned earlier. But if you'll look back at this red and green thing, the nether wart and tree, many people think that this is sort of the rule that red and green go together. The rule is that red and green can go together and it can look okay with each other. It's basically if it was a because in that kind of deal, pink should not no, pink or purple. I don't remember exactly which one it was. But pink, for example, should not go well with these colors. But if you actually use it properly, for example, let me see, not properly, but if you use it in small amounts or in a way that you do it on purpose, pink, if I added pink flowers in, it's sort of like like a contrast almost. So for example, this is the same techniques used in music. So I think music's a good example because many people understand it because they've listened to music their entire life. So this pink allium doesn't necessarily goes or pink or purple, but it sort of goes with the colors. It's a fairly decent color. I mean, I do like it, but I wouldn't build a house out of something that's pink in this world. Um, but for this, it's like music in the fact that in music there's there's certain notes that go together and there's certain notes that don't necessarily go together. And whenever you hear the notes that don't go together, it sounds a little bit off. However, in music, it's almost like you're wobbling along because they actually purposefully play notes that don't go together just so they can get back on track and play notes that do go together because then it creates a contrast between something that doesn't necessarily match to something that does match and fit together. So with color theory, the same way with music, you should not necessarily have everything go together. Not every color that you should add should go together and should look good in the world. In some cases, your build will look better if you add a color that doesn't look good in the build. because then you can resolve it. You can resolve the bad does look good. In fact, right now I'm adding these alliums because I forgot to do that right now. So having a color that doesn't necessarily perfectly match is a great way to show colors that do match really well. And let's see, what is another thing I can expound upon that? I was going to say something else, but then I got distracted by these alliums. Let's see. So yeah, it's a pretty good example, I think, with the music. If any of you play an instrument, you probably know about that already. Extremely useful. I'd recommend for people to actually do that with their builds as well, having that little bit of that contrast between colors that match and don't match. Same with the music as mentioned. Make sure that I got the other parts of this down. Yeah, it sort of has a bit of an off-kilter feel, so you could resolve it. Let's see. I think this is good. Looks good to me, though I want to keep building and fixing some things. I'll get back to what I was doing. I think this may be the last thing before questions, since I think this is it. Let me make sure. There's stuff about scale, but I think I already mentioned that. If I didn't, oh well, because it's not necessarily the most important thing. So the last thing is concept art. Many people use concept art to make sure that their builds or their organic or whatever they're making is going to look good and make sense. Well, I mean not look good because they could design one that looks good. However, to make sense and have a character that really fits together, that's very like high quality, because you're taking, not really taking, but you're using an idea that someone else created and is making a character or a build based on that idea. And generally it will make better sense whenever you actually finally fully do it. So that's one thing with concept art, is that you can do that and you can look at a concept art and base and design your organic or your build off of that concept art, and it will generally make more sense and end up looking better whenever you do that. And that's one reason why I haven't seen a whole lot of people do this, but I'm actually starting to do this myself. But creating concept art with my, or not organic, but with my build, I first create a concept art of what I want to make before I actually make it. Now, in this build, I didn't do that because this is a naturally generated seed. However, I actually did take a picture of the world and then actually put crabs in the background. I wanted to build at first a giant crab that was attacking the village, but I thought it was a bit cliche. It's so done and tried. Something attacking a village. Everyone does that. I want to do something a bit more unique. A village attacking a guy. That sounds nice. So I wanted to make sure it looked good. So I actually created a concept art of a crab creature attacking the village. But I don't actually have any pictures of it. I only have a recording of me having it. So I may actually have to post that sometime. But in that example, I think it's pretty decent example because that helped me understand so much. Because if I would have actually built in Minecraft, it probably would have looked better than the concept art because I don't know how to do concept art perfectly. However, it gave me an idea of what was going to look like if I was going to do it. I could picture it in Minecraft a whole lot better after creating the concept art, and helped me realize that, hey, this does not look as good as what I want it to look like. So I ended up creating this kind of deal here. I even created a concept art of the organic in the build as well, and that's actually how I figured out the height of the organic. If you look at the organic board, the organic is was planned to be roughly, I think, 64 blocks tall. I think. I think he's about 64 blocks tall, or maybe 128. Okay. Oh, okay, yeah, he was meant to be 128 blocks tall, but he's a little bit shorter than that, I think. Let me actually test that real quick. Make sure I got that right. So he is, say he's closer to his actual height, even though it's not necessarily important. Yeah, he's just under 100 blocks tall, about 90. And I actually knew roughly where he was going to be whenever I created him, because I did a little bit of math with the concept art that I made. I built a pillar there that was a certain height, and then I designed what kind of position I wanted him to be in. So then I knew what height I was going to need to be doing, so I could move the organic over and figure out the height of the character and along those lines. And because it's anatomy, there's a lot of issues with anatomy that are based on the height. For example, like head height, most people are about 7.5 heads tall. So the original position was actually him sitting down. So I wanted him to be able to fit in a roughly, I think it was 64 blocks tall. That was what it was, just above 64 blocks tall, in this region. That's why I wanted where I wanted his head to be while he was sitting. So I had to figure out how tall he was actually going to be. If that was roughly half his body, which ended up being about 128 blocks tall, and I actually I did a wireframe of the actual organic, and I just didn't like it, so I ended up removing it. So that's a pretty decent example of using the concept art to figure out the height of the character, to make sure that I got everything right, so I'm telling the story correctly. So a lot of these little tiny details help you design the story and figure it out a whole lot better, based on doing small little details like that. So that's pretty decent. Let me make sure that is that with the uh, creating concept art. So yeah, creating your own concept art, yeah, just extremely easy. I wouldn't recommend it for small builds like this build, because I did it on Bedrock. It's a lot bigger than what it looks. Um, but if you're going to do something small, like just one structure, making a concept art might be a good idea if it's really big. But yeah, if it's a decent sized build, it's probably just faster to do it in Minecraft, like small. But I would recommend if you're doing a very large project, do some concept art of it because it will save you time, especially if you're a building team. If you're a building team, I would recommend either looking up concept art or getting someone to actually learn how to create concept art so that you can have concept art for the entire team so that they know exactly what they're going to build. So then you have something that makes perfect sense because then you have maybe your best builder design the world and create concept for art for it, and then you can have people that are not necessarily the best builders in your building team actually start creating the world, and it will save you time and give those people that you are not like the best in the building team to be able to get some practice in designing something that they didn't, well, making something that they didn't necessarily like 100% design. It'll give them practice. You'll get a really nice world that was designed by someone who's like really really good. Yeah, it's just really good all around, and it's also faster because then you don't design while you're building. One problem I have, especially when using World Edit, I didn't have a problem with this on Bedrock because it takes so long to build anything, but on Java, whenever you're building something, you can get done with a part of the build, and then it didn't take very much time. So what you end up doing is trying to design the next part of the build. So for example, you design one, like you're doing the character and you design the wireframe, and then you start making the character, you build one leg, and then you're trying to figure out what you want the next arm to, you want like the arm to look like, and you're trying to design it. You're going to think about it for like 5, 10, 20 minutes, or if you're like me, you end up thinking about it for like an hour, and you end up not building because you were thinking about it for too long. If I had a concept art for it, then I would already know exactly what the arm was going to look like, so then I wouldn't need to figure it out and end up accidentally watching Netflix or, any other, TV show like I want to watch, or, Amazon or whatever. So in that case, that can be, extremely useful. If you have that concept art, it's already designed, you can just make it. You don't have to worry about designing it. It saves you a lot of time. That's one reason why I would like heavily recommend definitely creating concept art if you're doing a very large build. Especially if you're doing a very large build, definitely make like a full concept art. If you're doing something that's like smaller, as I said, it doesn't matter. Medium size, just do it in Minecraft. It's going to be about the same amount of time, or maybe a little bit slower, a little bit faster. It depends on what you're doing, the size of it, that kind of deal. But if you have trouble focusing, it might be a good idea to do a concept art on a medium one. Yeah, it depends on who you are, your personality, the things that you do there. Let's see what next part of this. Let's see. Um, already mentioned some stuff about the visual hook. Just want to sort of drive that home again because that's so important. Having a visual hook is a good idea. And using here, I think this is a little bit more important. Using techniques that you learned from other mediums of art is a really, really good idea. Many people that not really many people, but some people I see, most of you probably do not have this problem, since most of you are pretty good at building, since to know about BuildCon. But there's a lot of people, especially beginners, who think that Minecraft builds, you need to learn how to create Minecraft stuff from Minecraft builders. And yeah, it's definitely very helpful. Like in Minecraft BuildCon, amazing use for that. But whenever you're trying to learn something that you can't necessarily get from a Minecraft builder, or it's very difficult, or maybe there's just no tutorials on the subject, especially in Minecraft, there's a lot of things where there's no tutorials on certain subjects, a lot of which, a lot of the tutorials that are like that are on BuildCon. MCBuildCon's YouTube channel, they have some of the rarest kind of tutorials for Minecraft on there. I mean, building tutorials that are actually really high quality are very hard to come by for sure. Um, so in that case, it's very difficult to find stuff. So that's one reason I would recommend checking out YouTube channels that are not necessarily just about Minecraft, but possibly about painting. I've learned a lot from painting channels such as Marco Bucci or the Drawing Database, and there's also a lot of other places that you can check out as well. I'm not going to mention all of them because I don't know if I'm even supposed to mention other things, but whatever. Um, and using other resources besides Minecraft related stuff, such as story related YouTube channels that are trying to teach you how to write effective stories and stuff like that, or writing persuasive essays is extremely useful for that kind of use. Let me actually see. There we go. So that can be very useful to do with that, is having that visual. I mean, using different YouTube channels, and not just YouTube channels, different resources, books, as mentioned, painting, writing, sculpting, CG stuff, like I don't know, like stuff for Blender or whatever, or Cinema 4D, sculpting. Let's see, anything else? Uh, yeah, basically any kind of art that you can think of. Looking that up, like even animation, can be extremely useful for whenever you're trying to learn how to tell a story or do something like that within Minecraft and things along those lines. And I want to try to do one last example of visual storytelling that's like super obvious to sort of like drive this home. And I think that should be it. I think I went on just a little bit over time, but no one told me to stop. So you're welcome. There we go. You actually find a good little section. So let's actually decide one of these structures. Let's see, which one's my favorite? I think this one's probably my favorite, but it's a horrible spot. Let's actually go over to, I think, yeah, I think this is a good spot. It has that little area there. This is like a little manor, I think, or I don't know exactly what this is. It could be a barracks. Currently, I'm not entirely sure, which is a problem, isn't it? Especially since if people want to be walking around, you want to make sure people understand exactly what different things are meant to be used for. So I think this is going to be a good example. Let's see. Let's decide on what it's going to be. So there is a bit of an area for there to be people shooting off of, so it's definitely defendable. There's, let's see, one, two, three other defendable locations with little castle towers. So I'm guessing it's probably one of the areas that are like a barracks. I'm guessing the other places are other kinds of barracks, possibly something that is meant to be a place for you to do different tasks that an army would do, possibly a forge, whatever. Just in case if one falls, you could go to the other, or you could hide out in that one. So let's see. Let's see. What do we want this to be? Probably not a forge. There's not really enough. It doesn't seem like it'd be a good area to have something like that. I'd probably say a barrack seems pretty good. It's quite a bit bigger than the other. So if this is a barracks, we probably need a chimney for them to actually make some food. And I'm not going to build like a proper chimney. I'm just going to do something like super simple because I do not have like a lot of time probably to build an entire chimney for this. But probably, let's see, over in the back somewhere. Let's actually go inside. I want to go. Well, I'm going to go inside. You don't have to look inside. I want to see where all the room is in here. Oh, there we go. There's the other part of this. And here we go. So we have this much room. Where would I want? Where would I want a stove? That's a good question there. I think this back corner is probably a decent spot. So I'm going to build myself a little bit of a chimney here. I forgot to make a copy of this world too. So I'm going to delete this later. So I'm going to build myself a little chimney. And since most of the build is very structural looking, I'm probably going to make this a little bit organic, more organic looking, just to make it stand out a little bit. Have a bit of a curve where this build is. So probably just have this up here. So I have a little bit of contrast, which I call structural contrast. I don't know exactly what it's called, but having something that's organic paired with something that's very structural, sort of it's quite pleasing to the eye, and it attracts your eye because you see something that's like super curved paired to something else that's like super straight, and it seems a little bit odd. And in this case, it might be a bit of an extreme example, so sorry about that. It's don't do exactly what I do, but just learn from what I do. So let's see. A couple little details of bricks that are missing because the person that put this up is lazy because they don't care about their safety. And we'll do a little bit of smoke in here. I don't know. Meh. What time is it in this area? Probably like it's evening right now. I don't know. What time do I want to be? I think I'll just have just a campfire there since I'm too. I don't want necessarily have. Don't really want to make myself some actual smoke. Well, not actual smoke, but some smoke the using the cobwebs. That's decent enough. Got a little smoke coming out of there, and got a little bit coming out of there, and I think this is good enough with that. So now the barracks has a place for them to cook their stuff. I'm not going to actually build on the inside, but it's basically implied that there's a stove there, which is important because then people know that this is a place where people live and they need some place to eat. So they obviously eat, and they eat from the stove. Let's see what's next. I'd probably have some place like a target practice out in this area for sure. Possibly even a place for them to fish. I think it'd be pretty nice to have a spot for them to fish. I could possibly even have like a little staircase going down. I'm not going to build all that though because I'm too lazy. But uh, because this is a barracks, I'm guessing there's quite a few dudes up in this place. If there's plenty of dudes up in this place, obviously they're going to be wearing down a path in the dirt. So most likely they go around this tree. And I'm probably going to do a little bit of a build a little bit of path going up to it, showing that they definitely really enjoy going back here, or back here every day, and they all go back into this area and have worn down a path into the blocks that, well, not blocks, but they've worn a path down into the grass that is around their house where they go and practice. So this is probably I'm gonna make it a practice area because it is a barracks, so obviously they need to practice somewhere. So I guess I will have to make this that. And I want to use an armor stand, but I'm just going to use a fence post. There you go. Let's see what kind of fence post. Probably darker fence post because it's easier to clean, at least in my opinion. If you ever cleaned anything, it's easier to clean like darker colored stuff than lighter colored stuff. I mean, that's a little over detailed, but whatever. That's what this is basically about, is over detailing almost. So let's see, we got ourselves two little spots, and let's see, what do we want? I'm pretty sure there's even a Fletcher's thing too, so we could have, yeah, we have a Fletcher's fletching table, so we could have ourselves some fletching tables over to the side. I'd probably have some dirt to show that they walk back here quite a bit and go to these things there and here, and they walk up to it quite a bit. So, and here we go. With this, and let's see, I'm get a little bit of path in there, add a little bit of variation in the way that it is, and also signify where they sort of stand whenever they're shooting. So they're shooting up a little bit, even though that's not necessarily the best way to shoot bow and arrow. It's up at the target. Let's see. Anything else I can add to really show what's going on? Possibly some bows and arrows and some stuff around here. So this is where I start over detailing a little bit too far, but I'm going to do it anyway because I'm me. So I don't care. You can do what you want to do, but I'm going to have an armor stand down here, which I did in some parts of the build. Here we go. Have this. Let's see, you want there to be a, put that there, put this, and need to probably set a block in there. Though I don't think you can necessarily see what I'm doing since he's not over here currently. But that's fine because this is way too over detailed and not a very good example at the moment. Probably need to get a, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I would do that in my spare time, but since I do not have unlimited time to do this, I'm not going to go that far into detail. I'm just going to get like a item frame wherever that went. And you can obviously keep going, and I think I'm probably going to stop pretty soon with this detailing because I'm going to go too far if I'm not careful, since I do generally go too far whenever I detail. I have a couple fences along the side because obviously they're dudes. Okay, they're going to fall off if they're not careful, so I'm going to have at least something to sort of show that they try to avoid falling off. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I housed a bunch of dudes over here, I'd definitely have a fence going around to make sure that they don't fall off. There you go. I mean, I don't care about them too much, so it's gonna be a broken fence, but yeah, I would still have a little bit of a fence, make sure they don't do something stupid. There we go. And obviously this is not the best example, but this is a decent example, and I hope this is very, very helpful. This sort of shows you can sort of show exactly what a structure is through this visual language, and it's pretty obvious this is what you do. This is an obvious example of how this sort of visual language works, but you can keep going further and further and do things to an extreme, or you don't have to do it to an extreme, but do things in more obvious manners or more difficult techniques to try to tell people things that normally are unable to communicate whenever you are building something. I think it's quite useful. And Dord, how much time do I have? If I have any left? You just messaged me on Discord or something. I don't know. You may or may not lag out. That's fine, possibly. Negative. Okay. This is pretty much done, so it's base is basically done. Let me make sure. I'm gonna double check by looking at my notes real quick. Um, but I'm pretty sure that is done. But yeah, I'm gonna end basically with the point that I mentioned at the beginning, and that is, when in doubt, and you can't really remember what I said, if you're gonna take anything from this, a great way to design a story for your builds or whatever you're doing is to design your structures or whatever you're making as if it is a character with a personality and a past and a future that you may or may not know about. So designing it that way, it will give you a lot of opportunity to explain to the viewer a lot of different things that they may not necessarily pick up on if you wouldn't have built it in that kind of mindset of it actually having a past and a personality. Um, and one last thing, actually, when it comes to context, I just remembered. I was about to end. Just remembered something. This is actually really important. When it comes to the human mind, there's actually this is the last thing, so don't worry. I've gone on for too long. But the when it comes to the human mind, we put emotions in like unanimated objects. So an example of this is you've probably seen episodes of certain shows that do this, but if you were trying to sell a house, right? This is a bit of a joke. I saw this in a video. But if you try to sell a house and you just sell a house and let's say you say someone died in it and you don't say how they died, they'll just be like, oh, that's so sad. How did they die? And if you just say, oh, they died from old age, you're gonna be like, oh, they died peacefully. That's really nice. And they're gonna be pretty much perfectly happy to buy the house. Now, if you actually if you tried selling a house to someone and you told them that that house, someone died in it, and they asked, oh, how did the person die? And he said, oh, they were brutally murdered, then that house to them, they're going to look at it and feel like the murderous emotion, the murderous spirit in the house is still there. And they're not going to be as likely to buy the house. That's one reason why sometimes when someone's murdered in a house, the bank ends up taking the house and selling it for really cheap, is because less people want to buy the house because someone was murdered in it. They feel like, as I mentioned, the murderous emotion is still there. So if you want to make sure that you make a structure creepy or loving or nice, or if you want to sort of run home with that emotion and make sure people get what you mean, you can actually tell them a story like that or use the title to sort of make sure people understand that. Like if you're going to build a haunted house, make sure people understand what is in there, so they have an anticipation. And then the same way with other things, you can design a structure and say that Albert Einstein lived in this house, and they're going to feel like it's a genius's house. They're going to feel like it is a house of a genius, that they should be honored just walking in the door, and that they need to look at every detail because you never know what the genius left behind. So using that kind of storytelling where you actually tell a story can make your story that you're trying to tell even more and more apparent. Sort of like the same thing with the title. You can use that same exact thing, but this is basically more explained version of that. And I already ran home with the designing your structure like a character that has a personality and emotions can be extremely useful. So I'm pretty sure this is it. This is pretty much ending here. If you have questions, please ask me because this is extremely complicated. So yeah, Discord or whatever.